do. And I've heard just great things about him, and I look forward to hearing from him today. He is known as a U.S. Forest Service climate change specialist, and I will not enter into any more introduction from him. Stephen, you can introduce yourself more if you care to, but I welcome you today, and I look forward to hearing from you. Stephen, you're on.
Morning. Thanks, Paul. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, I'm seeing some thumbs up. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to join your service. I don't know if some of you may remember, I had the pleasure of speaking to your group about 5 years ago. That was a more detailed presentation about what does climate change mean for the Upper Peninsula, what evidence do we have, what have we already observed, what future projections are out there. And I thought that's what Paul wanted me to talk about again today. But thankfully, he crumpled all that up and threw it in the rubbish bin. And he gave me a more challenging thing to talk about today. And frankly, it's something that has been kind of stewing in the back of my mind for several years. So I actually appreciated the opportunity to put some words down on paper and try to articulate some half-baked thoughts that I've had for quite a while. And it's about this issue of how do we reckon with climate change denial as individuals, as a community, as a larger society. And that's a tougher thing than explaining the science of climate change, as I'm sure you can imagine. So that's the challenge here today, and we'll see if we make any headway. And so, as you can imagine, as someone who thinks about climate change day in and day out, it can be a little daunting, especially when you recognize that we still have this pervasive element of climate change denial in our society. It's sad, it's frustrating, it's frankly a shameful failure of our media, our political institutions, our education, and also just this us versus them mentality that's out there. And this is a really hard subject. It's easy to look away once you've seen a little bit about what climate change means for us and our futures. It can be very distressing. And so I understand why it's hard to get too deep and focus on it, like someone like Greta Thunberg, who was mentioned earlier. There are a lot of hard truths to grapple with. It just struck me a little while ago. I have a young son. He's a little over a year old. By the time he's my age, and I'm not that old, it's going to be past 2050. And I talk about 2050 a lot as kind of a benchmark year for climate change, midpoint of the next century. It seems like so far away. But I'm not that old. And when my son is my age, he's going to be living in that future time that I often describe kind of in an abstract sense. And when we get to the element of time, that can be a bit of a comfort when it comes to thinking about how we reckon with climate change denial. Because time will prove the deniers wrong, right? This is going to play out in the way we expect it to. And so ultimately, the evidence will reveal itself. And that can be a source of comfort, frankly, and kind of a smug satisfaction that, well, eventually I'll get my I told you so moment for all the deniers that are out there. And frankly, some of the folks I work with who are professionals who teach climate change and communicate climate change and study climate change, that's kind of the position that they have painted themselves into is, well, time will prove us right. We don't have to go out there and convince all the deniers. But that's honestly an unsatisfying and kind of a terrible outcome if you take that position. Because as we know, we can't let our current path play out into the future. That would be a terrible outcome for our planet and our society. And if you're waiting for that delicious chef's kiss, I told you so moment, most of the people you're going to want to say, I told you so to, probably won't be around to listen to it. And that's going to be so frustrating, right? And not to kid around too much, but we will have lost valuable time if we wait for time to prove us right. So I think it is important to continue to engage in this subject and not wait and wait. But we need to try to continue tipping the needle, getting more people to acknowledge the reality of climate change and to get behind solutions to both mitigate the problem and adapt to the impacts that we know are unavoidable at this point. So I hope I haven't, I hope that you see that there is still motivation, a driving force that should compel us to continue wrestling with this issue of climate change and denial and not just sit on the sidelines. So I'm gonna share my screen here and pull up just a couple of slides. Is everyone seeing that okay? Can you give me a thumbs up? Okay, so Stephen, how can we change people's minds about climate change and get them to admit this, this sad reality? Well, unfortunately, my message is that you can't. And you're not going to be able to change people's minds. So don't beat yourself up about that. And there are a couple important reasons to recognize why directly changing someone's mind about this issue is probably off the table and probably not something that we should continue approaching the problem in that way. And some of you have probably experienced this in real life. If some of you are Zoom experts, you can probably give me a thumbs up in your little chat window to let me know if you've heard or experienced some of this in your daily life. So why can't we change people's minds directly about climate change? Well, number one is you often run into this situation where there are shifting arguments. And once you start to have this conversation, it's not just attacking one position and overcoming that with science and facts. There's often this barrage or this maze of new arguments and new obstacles that are always shifting under your feet. And so you probably have heard some of these. The old favorite, that the science isn't settled on this. This is something that deniers often say to kind of throw confusion into the discussion. And the claim is that Earth's weather patterns and meteorology and climate system are so complex that how could we ever know how this system functions and what our effect on it is, when actually this science has been settled for quite some time. And the scientists are saying it as emphatically as they can possibly say it. Another thing you hear often, or another shifting argument that comes up, is that there's some sort of conspiracy, and that science is squelched if it does not conform to this conspiracy of climate change, and that there is some hidden truth out there that is being kept under the covers by the powers that be. You also hear this one that, okay, so the climate is changing. Well, it's natural and it's not that bad. The climate has always changed. 14,000 years ago, we were under a mile of ice in the Keweenaw. And so, you know, what's to get upset about that our climate is changing? Related to this, that it's God's will, right? There's higher forces directing changes that are occurring, and who are we to complain or try to change or get in the way of a plan that is greater than our understanding? Another favorite, whataboutism, right? What about China? What about India? What about Al Gore? What about da-da-da-da-da-da? And so it's also easy to distract from the issue by throwing up all sorts of other red herrings and, you know, false problems. And then the argument that climate change is really just some sort of subterfuge to change our way of life, and to take away our hamburgers and make us all ride electric scooters. And, you know, I'm sure you've heard this as well, that that climate change itself is not a sincere problem. What is really going on is something more sinister about the American way of life. There's the economic obstacles. This problem will cost too much to fix, and therefore we can't address it. Related to that, we have other priorities at the moment, and so this is not worthy of our attention. We are in the middle of a global pandemic. How could we ever dream to focus our attention on climate change? And then last but not least, one of the shifting arguments that's out there all the time. Yes, climate change is occurring. Yes, it's a problem. Yes, humans are causing it, but technology will save us. So there's no need to get terrified or panic right now if we all go out and buy a Tesla or wait for the wind turbines to materialize. This problem will solve itself, and no big deal. My point for going through these arguments is, again, just to restate that climate change denial is not about one intellectual position that needs to be debated and proven wrong and then, you know, touchdown. There's this shifting arrangement. And that's because this is really an insincere position at its heart. I don't think there's true belief in any of these arguments from the people that are peddling them and distributing them and promoting them to the mainstream. So there's no logical center there to connect with. And really, it's more about my team versus your team, this us versus them defensive kind of identity argument that we often get into. And so facts are insufficient. And this is supported by all manner of psychological research and you know, evidence about our cultural cognition as people, that our identities and our opinions about who we are and the team we belong to, that's a filter that goes in front of all of the knowledge and facts that come our way. So if you're not thinking about that identity and that filter, pouring facts on the problem is not going to do you any good. So where does that leave us? Well, quick detour about my work. So in my position, often put in front of skeptical groups, my job is to communicate to anyone who will listen about the risks of climate change and how to adapt, how to prepare. And so I am often in front of rooms like this. This is an example from last year in December in Wisconsin, when we could still meet in person. Those were the days. This is a group of loggers that I met in Eagle River, Wisconsin. And my job was to talk to them about what does climate change mean for you and your business? And how can we adapt to this change? And you can imagine, this is an older crowd, rural crowd, conservative crowd, a lot of talk radio getting listened to in these trucks, skeptical of government intervention. So this is really fertile ground for climate change denial. And you better believe I heard it. And so I'll just zoom in on one guy, this guy. Many of you know this guy. He's your uncle, he's your dad, he's your son or daughter. He is unconvinced and not willing to be convinced about the reality of climate change. We did an activity to share our pros and cons and concerns with climate change, and this was his comment to the group that this is all a globalist conspiracy. But it's my job to do this work. And over the years, I've, I think, stumbled into a couple of ways to have this conversation that I think leads to positive results, and getting people to move beyond that defensive us versus them kind of identity position. So I'm going to share with you some of my rules for success, or at least having more positive discussions. And I will say, I hope that these strategies will be useful when we're thinking about climate change denial, but also some of these other tough issues that are facing our society that are kind of anti-science and hard to figure out logically, right? Anti-vaccinations, QAnon, whatever the flavor of the day conspiracy is, there are people out there, our relatives, our family members, our community members, who are locked in. Time will prove them wrong, but again, that's not a satisfying result to wait them out. So let's think about how to bring them over compassionately. So some things that I think will work to our advantage. Number one, like I mentioned, and I think this gets to the heart of KUUF and one of your defining principles, and that's always treating people with respect and compassion, and not labeling people, not making fun of people. Okay, you can go ahead and you don't have to treat Hannity and Tucker Carlson with compassion. I'll give you a free pass. When I talked about that identity thinking that we need to do, having this discussion, it's important, and this is something we can laugh at, but I think there's real truth to this, and that's taking a moment to establish a shared connection with those moral foundations that are important for the audience you're dealing with. And that takes some thought and some empathy, but it's worth it to try to start a discussion based on shared moral foundations. And there's been some good research that goes into this, thinking about what kind of messages connect with a skeptical mindset, especially on environmental issues. So starting off with, respect for the purity of nature, and also a call to shared values in terms of what's important in terms of keeping our communities and families healthy. Like I mentioned, giving people time to talk about their problems and showing that you are focusing on their problems is really important. So a big section of my time dealing with skeptical and audiences that are prone to denial is letting them talk about how these changes are already affecting them and affecting their work. And people are not shy about this. They're willing to talk about
problems that they have. And it's important to let them do that, and to show also that you've done some thinking ahead of time, and that you see that, you hear those problems, and you can understand them. And then from listing problems, join them in the problem solving. Encourage them to think about, well, what would help us solve this issue? What would help us get past some of these climate change impacts? What would help us adapt and prepare for changes that we're already dealing with? And these are really fun discussions that I have with loggers who would otherwise be really standoffish. But problem solving is irresistible, and it's just part of our nature as humans. And then finally, this doesn't always come up, but I think it's really important to have in mind. You need to give people the benefit of the doubt, and allow people to get off of the hook gracefully. And on this climate change issue, it's important to have this in your back pocket, that people have been lied to deliberately on this issue for many years. And it goes back to corruption, and it goes back to money. And I think that's something even the most conspiratorial people can understand and agree with. And so it's okay to tell people that if it comes up. So again, these are some strategies that I think are helpful and that I have seen work. I'll go back just to wrap this up with this story of this room of loggers. And I mentioned this fellow earlier, and I will say, I didn't get him. He didn't walk out of there believing any more about climate change than he did walking in. But this guy, I did get. And he came up to me afterwards and was really touched and wanted to know more, and asked me sincerely, do you think we are causing this issue? I've never heard that before, that we could actually be the ones causing climate change. And he wanted to know more, and he was taking it seriously. And I will say, like I mentioned, I didn't win this guy, but I think I won the room, because everyone was having that discussion about climate change. We were all on the same team, problem solving and taking this issue seriously. And it can happen really suddenly. You'll be talking the same language with people that you wouldn't have expected to. So I think there's reason to be hopeful. And that is where I'll leave it. Thank you for listening.